The virgin mail-order bride was terrified, until the rancher's little girl asked, "Can you be Mama?" The stagecoach creaked to a halt in a cloud of dust, and the young bride pressed her gloved hands against her knees, willing them to stop shaking. The journey had been long, each mile carrying her further from the familiar and deeper into the unknown. She had answered an advertisement, sent a letter across miles of wilderness, and placed her life in the hands of a man she had never seen. Now, as the driver opened the door, her heart thundered with the weight of what lay ahead. She stepped down, her shoes sinking into the hard-packed earth. The air smelled of dust and horses, of sun-baked wood and distant grass. Her dress, carefully chosen though already worn thin, rustled as she clutched her small carpetbag. Her eyes lifted, and found him. The rancher stood a few yards away, tall, broad-shouldered, the brim of his hat shadowing his face. His stance was steady, his boots planted as though the earth itself had grown used to holding him. Lines carved his cheeks, the kind that came from years of labor and a silence too heavy to break. When his gaze fell on her, it was not unkind, but it carried the weight of expectation. She knew, in that single glance, that he had not sent for her out of romance or fancy. He had sent for her out of need. Her breath caught. She wanted to turn back, to climb into the coach and vanish down the road. But the wheels rattled as it pulled away, and the dust rose up between her and any escape. She was here now, bound by her promise and the letter that had carried her across miles. He tipped his hat, his voice deep and rough, shaped by years of wind and work. "You must be her," she nodded, unable to trust her voice. Fear pressed at her ribs, whispering that she had made a mistake. She had never lain beside a man, never felt the heat of a husband's claim, and though the letter had promised marriage, her heart quailed at what marriage might demand. Silence stretched between them until the sound of soft, hurried footsteps broke it. From behind the rancher's frame, a small figure appeared, a little girl with hair braided unevenly and a dress that bore the wear of many washings. She clutched the man's leg for only a heartbeat before her wide eyes lifted toward the stranger who stood frozen at the gate. The bride blinked, startled. She had not expected a child. The little girl tugged gently at her father's hand, then took a brave step forward. Her voice was light, but it carried like a bell in the stillness. "Can you be Mama?" The words struck harder than any wind across the plains. The bride's throat closed. No one had ever asked her for something so impossible, so pure. She sank to her knees, dust staining her skirts, and stared into those eyes filled with hope. Her hands trembled, but she reached out anyway, brushing her gloved fingers against the child's cheek. The girl leaned in as if she had been waiting for that touch all her life. Her small arms wrapped around the stranger's waist, clinging with the kind of trust that shattered walls. The rancher's face hardened, not in anger, but in something deeper, an ache he could not hide. His jaw tightened, his eyes shifting away as if the sight cut into him. Yet he did not move to stop it. The bride's fear began to unravel. She had come expecting duty and survival, prepared to give herself to a man she did not know. But in the little girl's embrace, she felt the stirrings of something she had never known. She longed for a place to belong. The ranch stretched wide behind them, its fences stretching toward the horizon, its house weathered by years of wind and sun. It was not gentle land. It spoke of labor, of loneliness, of nights when the wind howled through the cracks and mornings when work began before light touched the sky. But for the first time since stepping off that stagecoach, she did not feel entirely alone. The rancher cleared his throat, his voice quieter than before. "It's a hard life here. Not much time for softness." She looked up at him, still kneeling with the child in her arms, and for the first time, her fear softened into something steadier. She had thought she would face a stranger's bed with nothing but dread, but here was something unexpected. A little girl asking for a mother, and a man who, despite his walls, carried more weight in his silence than she could have imagined. The girl pulled back just enough to meet her eyes again. "You'll stay?" won't you?" The bride's lips trembled. She could not yet promise forever. But in that moment, with the dust still settling around her, she found the courage to whisper the only truth she could give. "I'll try." The child smiled, the kind of smile that filled the emptiness of the prairie with warmth no sun could provide. The rancher exhaled slowly, his shoulders shifting as though a burden had eased. The wind swept across the land, carrying with it the quiet beginning of a life that none of them had expected, yet all of them needed. The stagecoach rattled to a stop, wheels grinding against the gravel road as the driver tugged hard on the reins. Dust rose in a heavy cloud, turning the late afternoon sun into a hazy, burning disk over the prairie. The young woman pressed her gloved fingers tightly against her lap, feeling her pulse hammer beneath the worn fabric. Her journey had stretched across weeks. Town after town, strangers pressed too close in the coach, the endless stretch of barren land outside the window. And now, at the end of it all, she sat frozen, unable to move though the driver had already swung open the door. Her stomach knotted. She wanted to tell him she had changed her mind, that she had no business stepping down into this strange land, no business promising herself to a man whose face she had never seen. But the coach was already emptying of passengers, the driver impatient, her bag waiting on the ground like a silent witness to her choice. There was no turning back. She had written the letter. She had agreed to come. With a trembling breath, she lowered herself onto the dirt road. The sun struck her face like fire, and the air carried the smell of sweat, leather, and dry earth. Her shoes sank into the dust as she straightened her back, clutching the small carpetbag that held all she owned. She looked up, and there he was. The rancher stood apart from the others, his hat low against the sun, his arms folded across his chest. He did not move toward her, did not call her name. He simply stood and looked, his gaze sharp and heavy, the kind of gaze that could strip a soul bare without a word spoken. His frame was broad, weathered by years of labor, his boots caked with dust that no polishing could hide. He looked like the land itself, unyielding, harsh, but steady. Her breath caught. This was the man who had written to her, who had offered marriage in exchange for companionship, a roof, and the promise of permanence. She had read his words in her small rented room, her hands trembling then as they trembled now. But letters could not prepare her for the weight of him standing before her. "You must be her," he said at last. His voice was low, gravelly, as if shaped by years of wind across the plains. She nodded, unable to find her voice. Her hands tightened on the handle of her bag until her knuckles ached. Fear coiled in her chest, whispering that she had made a mistake. The rancher's eyes flicked over her once, measuring, assessing, not unkind but distant. He did not smile. He did not offer his hand. He only turned slightly, as if to say she could follow if she wished, and the space between them felt wider than the whole prairie. She swallowed, took one step forward, and then another sound reached her ears. A light patter of footsteps, quick and uneven, carrying across the silence of the town. She looked down, and her breath stilled. A little girl had appeared at his side, no older than 6 or 7. Her hair was a tumble of uneven braids, tied with fading ribbon. Her dress was patched and faded, but her eyes, those wide, searching eyes, held a brightness that no hardship could dim. She pressed close to the rancher's leg for a moment, shy, before curiosity carried her forward. The bride stiffened. She had not expected this. The letter had not spoken of a child. The little girl stepped out from behind her father and studied the stranger with unabashed wonder. She tilted her head, her gaze flicking over the young woman's dress, her gloves, her pale and nervous face. And then, in a voice so clear and tender it silenced the restless crowd around them, she asked, "Can you be Mama?" The words struck harder than any gust of wind. They sank deep into the bride's heart, scattering her fear into something rawer, more fragile. Her lips parted, but no sound emerged. She stared down at the child, at the innocence shining in those eyes, at the hope trembling in the small voice. The rancher stiffened, his jaw tightening, but he did not speak. He looked away, as though the question carried too much weight even for him. The bride felt her knees weaken. She lowered herself slowly, dust clinging to her skirts, until she was at the child's level. Her gloved hand lifted, trembling not with fear this time, but with something she could not name. She brushed her fingers gently across the girl's cheek. The child leaned into the touch without hesitation, as if she had been waiting for it all her life. Tears stung at the back of the bride's eyes. She had thought herself empty, thought she had come here only to fulfill a bargain of survival. But in the warmth of that small cheek, in the desperate trust of those young eyes, something inside her shifted. The girl smiled, a small, fragile smile, and then wrapped her arms around the stranger's waist. The bride froze, then slowly let her carpetbag drop into the dust, her arms circling the little body in return. The child fit against her like something she had been missing without ever knowing it. The rancher cleared his throat, his voice rougher than before. "We'd best get moving. Long ride back." She lifted her gaze, meeting his eyes over the child's head. For the briefest moment, she saw something unguarded in his face, something aching, something wary, something that wanted to believe as much as it wanted to protect. Then it was gone, shuttered behind the same unreadable mask. He turned toward the waiting wagon, and she followed, the child's small hand now wrapped tightly around hers. The road stretched long and quiet as the wagon rolled away from town. The bride sat stiffly, her hands folded tight in her lap, the child pressed close beside her. The rancher guided the horses with practiced ease, his shoulders squared, his face unreadable. The silence between them grew heavy, broken only by the squeak of wheels and the creak of leather harness. The bride dared a glance at him. His profile was strong, worn by sun and years, his eyes fixed firmly on the horizon. He did not look at her, did not speak, and yet she felt the weight of him pressing into every corner of the wagon. Her gaze dropped to the child, who had nestled against her arm as though it were the most natural thing in the world. The warmth of that small body against hers was steadying, grounding. She drew a slow breath, her fear loosening its grip just enough to let something else take root. The land rolled out around them, wide and endless, a sea of grass and sky. It was beautiful and terrifying all at once, a place where a soul could be lost or remade. She wondered which fate awaited her here. By the time they reached the ranch, the sun had begun to sink, painting the sky in streaks of fire. The house loomed large and weathered, its wood worn gray by wind and rain. Fences stretched out across the land, cattle grazing in the distance, barns and sheds scattered like bones across the earth. It was not a gentle place. It spoke of labor, of loneliness, of years carved into calloused hands and weary eyes. The rancher halted the wagon and climbed down. He offered no hand to help her, but she found her footing and stepped into the dust, clutching her bag once more. The child tugged her forward eagerly, leading her toward the house as though it were already hers. Inside, the air smelled of wood smoke and earth. The furniture was sturdy, rough-hewn, built for use, not beauty. The silence of the place pressed heavy on her chest, as if the walls themselves remembered years of quiet. The rancher set his hat on the table, his eyes flicking toward her. "It ain't fancy, but it'll keep you dry. You'll have your room upstairs." She nodded, unsure if her voice would hold. The child tugged at her skirt again, her eyes wide with pleading. "You'll stay, won't you?" The bride sank to her knees once more, her throat tight, her heart pounding with something she could not name. She brushed a strand of hair from the child's face, her lips trembling as she whispered, "I'll try." The girl's smile returned, small but radiant, filling the dim room with warmth. The rancher stood silent, watching, his expression unreadable. But for the first time, his shoulders eased, just enough to betray the truth, that he wanted to believe she would stay too. The night closed in around them, the prairie winds whispering against the walls. And in that house, under that roof, 3 lives that had been broken and lonely stood at the edge of something unspoken, something fragile, something that might grow. The first night on the ranch was restless. The bride lay awake in the narrow bed of the upstairs room, staring at the wooden beams overhead. The sheets smelled faintly of soap and dust, clean but unfamiliar. The silence was broken only by the soft creak of the house, the low call of the wind slipping through cracks in the shutters, and somewhere in the darkness, the faint sound of the rancher moving about in his own room. She pressed her hands against her chest, feeling the steady drum of her heart, each beat loud in the emptiness. Her thoughts turned to the little girl. The warmth of those small arms still lingered against her waist, the plea of that innocent voice echoing in her mind, "Can you be Mama?" She had no answer for such a question, no experience, no certainty. But the child's trust had sunk deep, pulling threads of tenderness she had thought buried forever. The dawn came early, the gray light creeping across her floor before she had managed a moment of true rest. She rose when the sound of movement below told her the rancher was already at work. When she descended the stairs, she found the kitchen quiet, the table bare, the fire smoldering low in the hearth. The man stood outside the window, hauling feed for the horses, his muscles taut with the weight of labor. She stepped into the kitchen, her fingers brushing the counter, the shelves, the pans hanging from nails. It was a house that carried a woman's absence, duties done by hands that had no choice but to endure. The dust on the shelves, the rough edges of meals made only for survival, the emptiness of a space that had not heard laughter in years. She pulled off her gloves and set her bag aside. Without thinking, she began to move. By the time the rancher returned, a fire burned bright, the smell of bread warming the air. The child sat at the table, her braids undone, her eyes wide with delight as the stranger set a plate before her. The rancher paused in the doorway, his chest heaving from work, his hat in hand. His eyes flicked to the meal, then to the woman standing quietly at the stove, her cheeks flushed with heat and effort. For a moment, he said nothing, but the silence felt different, thicker, heavier, as though he were holding back words he didn't know how to give. The child filled the silence with her chatter. "She made bread, Papa. And eggs too, like magic." The man lowered himself into a chair slowly, his gaze still fixed on the woman. At last, he muttered, "You didn't have to." Her hands stilled on the counter. She turned, her voice soft but steady. "I wanted to." Something flickered in his eyes, something he quickly masked as he reached for a piece of bread. He chewed slowly, the roughness of his features easing just slightly. The girl giggled, crumbs scattering across the table, and for the first time the house seemed less empty. The days that followed settled into rhythm. She rose before the sun, her hands finding tasks without needing to be told. She swept the floors, mended the girls' dresses, learned the stubborn creak of the pump at the well. At first the work was heavy, the ranch unforgiving, the dust clinging to her lungs until she thought she might choke. But each night, as the child curled against her side before bed, the fear loosened its grip. The rancher spoke little. His words were short, clipped, his presence looming like a shadow she could never quite touch. Yet she saw the way his gaze lingered when he thought she wasn't looking, the way his shoulders eased when he found the girl laughing in her arms. He carried his grief like a stone, heavy and unyielding, but in fleeting moments it cracked, showing a glimpse of something softer, something he no longer believed he deserved. One evening, a storm swept across the prairie. The wind howled, rattling the shutters, and the girl cried out in fear. The woman pulled her close, holding her in trembling arms as the thunder cracked like cannon fire overhead. She whispered lullabies she barely remembered from her own childhood, her voice breaking, her heart racing. The girl clung tighter, her small fingers digging into the fabric of her dress. When the rancher entered the room, lantern in hand, he froze at the sight of them. His eyes lingered on the way the girl pressed against her, the way the stranger whispered comfort into her hair. His jaw tightened, and without a word he set the lantern down and left. But in the morning, when the storm had passed, he lingered longer at the breakfast table, his eyes meeting hers across the room, a silent acknowledgement of what he had seen. The bond between the woman and the girl deepened with each day. The child began to follow her everywhere, into the garden, to the wash line, even to the well. She asked endless questions, her laughter ringing across the yard like music the house had long forgotten. And each time the woman answered, each time she bent to brush hair from the girl's eyes or tied a ribbon into her braids, the emptiness inside her filled with something she had never known she craved. But with each tender moment, the weight of the rancher's silence grew heavier. He watched, always watched, his eyes unreadable. She felt his gaze in the fields, in the kitchen, in the stillness of night when the floor creaked beneath his step. She longed to ask what haunted him, longed to know the grief that lay behind his eyes, but the words caught in her throat. The breaking point came one evening when the girl, drowsy from the day's work, pressed her cheek against the woman's shoulder and whispered, "I don't want you to leave." The bride's breath caught. She tightened her hold, her heart pounding. "I won't," she whispered, though the truth was she did not know if she could stay forever, if she was strong enough, if she was wanted enough. The rancher's voice came from the doorway, low and rough. "Don't promise what you can't keep." She looked up sharply, her eyes meeting his. For the first time, she saw not only hardness but fear, the fear of losing again, of watching hope slip away. Her own voice trembled, but she forced the words out. "I don't break what I promise." Silence stretched, heavy and charged, until he turned away. But the crack in his armor had been made, and she saw it each day that followed. His words grew longer, his voice softer. He began to ask about her past, about the life she had left behind. She told him pieces, never all, but enough for him to know the loneliness she carried. In return, he spoke of his wife, gone too soon, leaving him with a child and a house that felt more like a grave. His voice broke when he spoke of her, and she reached for his hand before she could stop herself. He let her touch linger. The weeks melted into months. She no longer counted the days since she had arrived. The land that had seemed harsh now carried its own beauty. The way the sun painted fire across the horizon at dusk, the way the cattle moved like shadows across the fields, the way laughter echoed against the wide sky. The child grew bolder, happier, her small hand always reaching for hers. And the rancher, though still silent, allowed himself to stand closer, to sit longer at the table, to look at her not as a stranger but as something he had not dared hope for. One evening, as the sun sank low, the girl curled against her side and whispered, "Your mama now." The words broke her open. Tears filled her eyes as she pressed a kiss against the child's hair. Across the room, the rancher watched, his hands tightening against the chair. When she lifted her gaze, their eyes locked, and in that silence, something passed between them, an unspoken vow, a recognition that though they had been strangers, though they had carried fear and grief, they had built something stronger. He crossed the room slowly, each step heavy with years of solitude breaking away. When he reached them, he placed his hand gently on the girl's head, then let it rest against the woman's shoulder. His voice was quiet, raw, stripped bare. "Then stay." Her heart pounded, her throat tight with tears. She nodded, unable to speak, her hand rising to cover his. The girl's laughter filled the room, bright and certain, sealing what words could not. The prairie wind swept against the house, carrying the scent of earth and grass, carrying the promise of nights no longer filled with silence. In the arms of a child and the steady hand of a man who had lost and learned to hope again, the bride found what she had never thought possible. Not just survival, not just duty, but family. And this time, she did not tremble. She belonged. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now. Watch another unforgettable tale where destiny and courage collide in the way you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.